As I had said, Ken Bailey was a New Testament scholar, but he was also a missionary in the Middle East from 1955 until 1995. And it was his experience as a missionary that provided him the insights that he had as a scholar into the New Testament. And yet, Bailey's career as a missionary was often fraught with difficulty. Bailey lived through 7 major wars or internal conflicts in the Middle East during his time there. The first was the Second World War. He was 11 years old and he needed to be evacuated out of Egypt at that time as Rommel's Afrika Korps tanks were making their way across North Africa. He was back in Egypt at the time of the Suez Crisis in 1956. He was in Beirut at the time of the Six-Day War in 1967 and needed to be evacuated out of Beirut at that time. He was still in Beirut in the 1970s and 1980s at the time of the civil war in Beirut, which lasted from 1975 to 1990. And he was present in Beirut during the Israeli invasion of that country in the early in the 1980s. He was fed up with the violence and war and so forth that was going on at this time, and so he eventually leaves Beirut and goes to Israel from 1985 to 1990. But 1987 was the beginning of the first Intifada in Israel, and so he got caught up in the violence and the horror of the Intifada. And he finally left Israel in 1990 and moved to the peaceful island of Cyprus so he could remain in the Middle East and continue to preach in churches in the Middle East and in Israel. But 1991 was the time of the first Gulf War, which was also very disruptive for his career at that time. So he lived through some really difficult times in the history of the Middle East. Also, his personal career was often difficult. He was working in Egypt, as I've said, from 1955 to 1965. His visa and his work permit were not issued in 1965. Again, were not reissued to him in 1965. So he was forced to leave Egypt because of some controversies that he had gotten involved with that got him in trouble with the local police. And then in 1985, once again, he's really forced to leave Beirut. The violence had gotten so bad, and Americans were being kidnapped and held hostage, kidnapped off the streets and held hostage for months and even years at a time. Bailey had his wife drive him to work because women were basically respected at this time. They would not be taken as hostages. So his wife could drive him to the seminary where he would teach, but he had to crouch down in the back seat so no one could see him as he went back and forth from his apartment to the seminary where he was working. And he finally decided that even that was becoming too dangerous, and he simply needed to leave. So Bailey had a really difficult time living through all these wars and the violence and the disruptions of the Middle East. And yet, throughout it all, he preached regularly. He was probably in the pulpit virtually every Sunday that he was there, often in very traditional church settings, that is, in traditional villages. But whatever venue was open to him, he took that opportunity. He was teaching regularly, not just at the seminary, but to a variety of other groups. When he came home on furlough every 5 years from his missionary work, rare was the Sunday that did not find him in a pulpit somewhere in the United States. He was a much sought-after speaker, as well as a writer that people deeply respected because of his insights into the Bible. But those insights, despite all of the difficulty of the time that he had in the Middle East, were due to the fact that he had been able to live through his his career in the Middle East and absorb the culture that he found there, so that he could reinterpret Scripture. So his missionary career was not ancillary to who he was. It was absolutely central to who he was as a human being, because that was his calling. But also it was central to him because it gave him the essential insights that he had as a scholar, which are the central focus of his scholarship that we enjoy today. His idea that Jesus' life and teachings need to be reinterpreted according to traditional Middle Eastern culture.